About 20 years ago, a low-level staff worker at the Pentagon was tasked with a project. They said, we want you to investigate what would be the impact of a military attack on the communications system in the US. He spent about 2 years researching, studying things we could find out easily. It wasn't secret information. He gave his report to his boss. The boss got scared. The boss gave it immediately to his boss. That boss got scared. Went up the ladder. Within a day, it was in the White House. The White House got scared. They immediately, report comes down from the White House, and they took the report away from the guy who wrote it and from several layers of the bosses above him, saying it's too secret, it's too sensitive, it's too important, it's too scary. Obviously, this got out, that this had happened, and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal called The Ultimate Secret, a Pentagon report its author can't see. The author can't see the report anymore. It was taken away from it. Why? Why was this report so sensitive, so secret? A Pentagon spokesperson, in answering that question, said this: when you put things together, you sometimes get a whole that's more sensitive than any of its parts. In other words, when you get a bird's eye view of what's going on, all of a sudden things come into perspective in a way that you didn't understand before. You understand what's happening and the impact of what's happening in a way that you just didn't get before. Well, today, I'd like to give you, or attempt to give you, a bird's eye view of the gospel in the world. And there are going to be 4 parts to it. One, we're going to look at global gospel trends. What's happening that we can see from statistics, that we can see from quantitatively what's happening in the world. Second, we're going to look at Europe's strategic importance in light of those trends. Thirdly, we're going to look from the point of view from history, from the 18th century Great Awakening, and say, why is Europe right now so important in terms of the world? And then lastly, we're going to talk briefly about the European Leadership Forum as a strategy, a global strategy that's a response to this. So first, looking at the first chart in front of you, trying to gain a bird's eye view, one of the first things people try to do is say, from a biblical point of view, is say, what's happening with the gospel? How are people responding to the gospel? And you see in this chart that many people are coming to Christ around the world. I mean, we haven't seen something like this for 2,000 years. We're living in an amazing time in church history where whole continents are becoming Christians. Some countries have switched their religion, so the majority of people now are evangelical. At the beginning of the century, they weren't. We're seeing explosions. In Latin America, 5,000% growth from 1900 to 2000. In Africa, 4,000% growth from 1900 to 2000. In Asia, 2,000% growth. Some countries like China, the best estimates we have, about 1 million born-again believers in 1900, over 100 million, 100 years later. I mean, God's doing amazing things around the world. We're seeing something that is really wonderful, but not everywhere. The next slide is a picture of Europe. There's 2 volumes called the World Christian Encyclopedia, published by Oxford University Press. And they're giant books. You've seen those the books that you never open up, you never look inside. But on the first page of these 2 giant volumes, there's an amazing quote. At the very front end of this is what they say. They said, no one in 1900 expected the massive defections from Christianity that subsequently took place in Western Europe due to secularism, and in Russia and later Eastern Europe due to communism. He's saying nobody foresaw it. There's something has happened in this century that nobody saw coming. Now, we've seen 2 basic snapshots. One, a growth of the gospel in the developing world, and we've seen an amazing decrease, a fall off in Europe. But we're going to look at this from a different perspective. I'm going to look at a different set of charts really briefly. First of these charts is comparing evangelicalism, that's Bible-believing Christians, folks who believe the Bible, believe in justification through faith, folks from different denominations, but are folks like us, compared to Catholicism and Orthodoxy. If you look in this chart, Catholicism has barely maintained its percentage of the world's population. It's not growing significantly. Even though the bulk of its people were in places of very fast-growing populations, they're just barely maintaining. Orthodoxy is actually a dying religion, a dying faith. They've lost 50% of their percentage of the world population. It's this century's Christian Science. 100 years ago, Christian Science was booming. Now, you can't find a Christian Science. In the next century, that's what's happening with Orthodoxy. It's getting smaller and smaller. The Orthodox focus on their traditions and their culture. Catholicism focuses on authority. In contrast, we as evangelicals focus on the gospel and we focus on mission. We focus on communicating the gospel. And the result of that is whole countries and areas of the world have moved and become evangelical largely. Now, the Catholics and the Orthodox know this is going on. There was a very interesting quote in a lecture by the Pope 2 years ago. Pope Benedict was talking about these world trends, and this is what he said. He said, the geography of Christianity has changed dramatically in recent times and is in the process of changing further. Faced with a new form of Christianity, which is spreading with overpowering missionary dynamism, sometimes in frightening ways, the mainstream Christian denominations often seem at a loss. In other words, frightening ways. This is almost, you can hear the fear in his words. The Catholics are seeing their people move in droves to evangelical churches in the developing world. They're seeing it all around them. They don't know what to do. What else does he say about it? Now, this is his critique of evangelicalism. He says, this is a form of Christianity with little institutional depth, little rationality, even less dogmatic content, and with little stability. This worldwide phenomenon that bishops from all over the world are constantly telling me about poses a question to us all. What is this new form of Christianity saying to us, for better or for worse? I mean, his bishops are constantly telling him, we're losing the flock. Okay? So we're seeing this, comparing evangelicalism to Catholicism and Orthodox, we see this incredible growth comparison of those two. We all see something very similar when we compare evangelicalism to other major faiths, other world religions. If you look at the next slide, you see, Buddhism is just like Orthodoxy, it's dropping off. It's losing 24% of the world's population between these two time periods, 1900, 2000. Hinduism, even though it's been in India, which is a booming population, it's only maintained its percentage of the world population. Islam is the only world faith that's grown. But it hasn't grown as a missionary force by conversion primarily. It's grown in numbers in terms of the size of the families, the numbers of the people actually growing and living in the Muslim areas. But even compared to Islam, we're doubling the rate of their growth in terms of the world. So far, this is really pretty good news. Other than Europe that we briefly touched on, it's pretty good news. So in the midst of this situation, amazing growth for the gospel globally, why should we even care about Europe? Why should we care? You hear phrases like, we need to get where God's moving and get there. We need to get involved where God's going. We can have a leveraged impact if we go to involved in Africa or Latin America or Asia. And there's really exciting things going on and really wonderful things going on. But I'd like to suggest to you that Europe right now is enormously strategic for the gospel globally. Enormously, far more than we realize, far more than the worldwide church realizes. Europe is the battleground for the gospel today. I'm going to give you 3 arguments for that. First, Europe's historic influence. In the last 500 years, almost all the world's leading movements have come out of Europe. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment, all the new academic disciplines, the disciplines you've studied in university, all came from Europe. The scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, existentialism, Marxism. Just think of Marxism. 25 years ago, Marxism dominated a third of the world. That's just a European ideology that's gone global. Nazism, the cause of a world war. It's a European ideology. Postmodernism, this philosophical movement, all these things are European in origin, and they've emerged as global influencers. They've influenced and started worldwide wars. They've shaped the modern university. They've framed ideology for billions of people globally. If the church is going to understand and respond to these movements, these ideas, these challenges to the gospel, we have to understand Europe. We have to understand where these ideas came from and understand that often they're competitors to the gospel. To effectively communicate the gospel, to have been influenced by these folks, we need to find a way to do it with relevance and truthfulness. Now, what makes this even more important is the way that Europe has shaped America. I did my PhD at Northwestern University, and people think of it as a leading American university. It's not. It's a leading European university with an American accent. All those academic disciplines I studied, all created by Europeans. All those intellectual structures and systems of thoughts, of ways of viewing the world, all the spectacles people put on to look at the world, they came from Europe. In its origin, the scientific revolution emerged from Europe. All these ways we've all been educated. We've been educated in European categories of understanding our world through the modern university. And that's one of the strongest outposts of European culture in America is the university. And from the university into the media. But the media is a derivative from the university. So not only is Europe influencing the world intellectually from this broader, but they're also educating the world, sometimes at European universities, sometimes at American universities. I didn't know a single PhD student when I was there at Northwestern that was a born-again evangelical Christian or a professor. They're secular breeding grounds of European ideologies and academic disciplines. But if you look just at, the importance of education in the world today, it is the ladder to success. For anybody, growing up around the third world, the developing world, their best way to get up that ladder of success is to get a degree from a Western university, a good Western university. A friend of mine traveled for 6 weeks in Africa. He said, Greg, it's just amazing when you hear somebody speak that has an advanced degree. And then he summarized it. He said, when a PhD from Cambridge talks, the room gets quiet. Well, that's where the credibility is. That's where the influence is. That's where the leadership is. Individuals are getting degrees, going back to their countries from all around the world, and these folks are getting the degrees from Europe or the Europeanized American universities. So they're not only influencing the world broadly over the last 500 years, they're educating the world today. Third, and this is the most important of all these reasons, the fastest growing religion in the world is not one I've talked about so far. Fastest growing religion in the world is unbelief, and it comes from Europe. Now, evangelicalism is often described as the most dynamic, fastest growing religious movement. It's not. It's not. We are getting crushed in this global process of change, of conversion, by unbelief, by hardlined atheists and those they've influenced, agnostics. It's almost 1 billion people in this category right here. This is a global movement, and it's moved almost from, it's almost nothing, less than 1% in 1900, to at least 12%. The highest we see is up to 20% in terms of statistics, but it's at least 12%, 12 to 15, 20% of the world's population in just 100 years. We thought we did great when we went from 4.5% or so to 11% as evangelicals. They've gone from less than 1 past us, 12, 15%. We're living in a global pandemic. Worldwide atheism has come from Europe and is now infecting the world. Think about this for a second. 90% of European atheists, of global atheists, were in Europe in 1900. 90%. It means it's a European-bred movement. People who don't believe in God or any kind of religion. That was a European reality. In 2000, those numbers have almost flipped. There's almost 90% of the world's atheists are not in Europe anymore. Even though Europe's atheists have exploded in growth in that same 100-year period, still it's exploded even further around the world. So the vast majority of the world's atheists aren't even in Europe anymore. And the same thing's true with agnosticism. European atheism has become a global movement. Let me just try to picture this for you in an illustration. There's a thing that we've been scared about in the media for the last 10 years or so called avian bird flu. The idea behind it is, what if a particular flu that comes from a bird in Asia or in Africa, if it somehow is able to infect human beings and it could immediately affect a huge group, it could be a pandemic. It could be this incredibly quickly spreading pandemic. Why? Because people fly in and out of airports all the time. I met with somebody that just a couple days ago was in China. I was in, yesterday morning I was in Chicago. I've been sometimes in my travels from different cities every day. We travel the world right now, like the blood in the blood system, in our circulatory system. We're constantly traveling. You pin down where a blood cell is, a few seconds later, it's somewhere else. And that's what happens if you have an infection in one place. We're fearful that that infection will quickly spread to the globe. What I'd like to say to you this morning is that's already happened spiritually. We're living in the middle of a spiritual pandemic and we don't even know it. We don't even know that the world is deathly ill, is getting sick, and is spiritually dying, and we haven't developed the antidotes. We haven't identified the viruses. We haven't developed the strategies, the techniques to deal with it. We haven't done what we need to do under God to respond to the disease that we've been infected with, the world's been infected with. Europe is the battleground for the gospel right now. The greatest opponent of the gospel is not Islam, it's not Hinduism, Buddhism. The greatest opponent of the gospel is unbelief. And that's not just true in Europe, it's true in America. And it's true around the world. Now, I've kind of given you the bird's eye view. I haven't explained why this has happened. I haven't tried to give an explanation of why. And sometimes you have to answer the questions of why to really define reality. You've got to understand and go down a little deeper beyond just saying what's happening, to say why is this happening? And once you understand why it's happening, then you can think about what to do or how to do it. But why has this happened? You know, if you can imagine going to a dentist office and you talk to the dentist and you say, I've got this headache. And they say, okay, lie down here on the table. Let me get my drill and I'll do some brain surgery. You know, it's a foolish thought. It's a foolish idea. Why? Because you're going to diagnose it. You're going to run tests. You're going to do an MRI. You're going to do all sorts of things to try to understand where that headache is coming from. Well, in the same kind of way, we need to understand a little bit more why this has happened, what's going on, so we can understand how to respond. And to do that, I'd like to start in an odd place. From my perspective, history is one of the greatest sources of wisdom that we have. We understand what's happening today. Oftentimes, we can look at today from the window of the past. We can look at a period of history and understand why we're dealing with what we're dealing with when we look at it from understanding a picture of time that was similar in some way. What I'd like to do in just the next few minutes is to go back in history and talk about John Wesley and the Great Awakening. I think it can be particularly instructive for Europe, but also for the world. This is done because the adage, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I don't want to repeat some of the same mistakes that Wesley did and that the Great Awakening did. Now, the positive about Wesley and the Great Awakening. He led, under God's direction, a spiritual awakening 270 years ago that changed England powerfully. And changed, you could even say, had a big impact on the world. From about 1740 to 1850, it provides an uncanny parallel to today's church. From worldwide global evangelicalism from about 1900 to 2000, it's very similar. So when I talk about the Great Awakening, you're going to see a picture that can be applied, I think, right across the board to developing world evangelicalism. What did Wesley do? He ministered in an age called the Gin Age. Half the children were born out of wedlock. It was sexual promiscuity. It was common in all classes. It was to this culture that Wesley communicated the gospel. He communicated why the gospel was true. He powerfully communicated salvation through faith in a moral disorder of a gin-drinking, gambling, lewd society. Wesley taught the importance and the power and the beauty of holiness. You know, some material problems of slavery and poverty and exploitation of workers. He taught the biblical value of each person. In response to a spiritual deadness, he talked the reality of an experience with God. In other words, it was incredibly powerful how the Lord used Wesley in this whole movement to light a fire. So by the end of Wesley's life, there was 100,000 Wesleyans meeting weekly in small groups, bands, and classes, answering the question, what's the state of your soul? In other words, wrestling with how to grow with God. They saw God move in a powerful way. Now, the value of Wesley as a model for the developing world should be pretty obvious right now. He is a powerful model of how individuals can communicate the gospel effectively, plant churches by the hundreds, lead a thriving national movement, developing lay leadership, confronting sexual trafficking, prostitution in the developing world, like he did slavery in his day, leading political initiatives to reflect the character of God. All of these things are powerful. And Wilberforce followed up from Wesley. Most people don't realize, but at the very end of Wesley's life, Wilberforce wrote a letter to Wesley and said, I think God's calling me to fight slavery. And Wesley wrote him back, and this is one of the last letters we have of Wesley's before he dies. And Wesley wrote back to him and said, you will surely fail unless God has called you to this task. But if God has called you to this task, give your all to it. And that's exactly what Wilberforce did over the next 40 years. And 40 years later, 3 days before Wilberforce died, slavery was eliminated in the British Empire. 40-year process of reflecting the character of Christ into the culture. He was either started or led or was on the board of directors of about 80 different organizations reflecting the character of Christ, eliminating child labor, not just slavery, the idea of cruelty to animals, you name it. They were seeing powerful impacts in the culture. But what didn't they do? They were greatly successful, but they also failed miserably. They failed miserably. What happened to the Great Awakening? Wesley did not prepare the church for the challenges that eventually destroyed it. His focus was on popular evangelism, spiritual growth for believers, and cultural change. Those are good things. In 100 years, we saw England change from the Gin Society to the Victorian Society, where middle class and upper class families were having devotions on their knees in their living rooms. This powerful impact. But something happened. These evangelicals that had been on a growth path of over 100 years of progress, seeing the gospel go out, seeing it impact the culture. What does that chart look like right here? It looks just like the chart of the developing world, or the growth path of the developing world over the last 100 years. In other words, they experienced the same kind of thing, and they thought at the end of that 100 years, it was going to continue to go up. They had nothing else to argue against that perspective of a growth going forward. And guess what happened instead? In England, it went down like this. It was crushed by a movement that it didn't know it had, that was growing up in its midst and eventually ripped the legs out from the Christians all across England. So within a couple generations, the English cathedrals become hollow shells. You go to a cathedral in England today, there's a few people there, at most. England churches have been devastated by this movement. And this movement is a movement that has many parts. I'm just going to talk about three parts of this movement that emerged from the Enlightenment. And this is this period of intellectual discovery from about 1600 to 1800. And you have to understand, in its origin, the Enlightenment was not against Christianity, was not against theism. In many areas, it was inspired by the Christian faith. The vast majority of the members of the British Royal Society, which really led the first part of the scientific revolution, they were Orthodox believers. They were Bible-believing Christians. So even someone like Isaac Newton was a firm theist. Newton, most people don't realize, he wrote more about the Bible than he did about science, because he believed in the book of God and the book of nature. So because people believed in an orderly universe, they believed in rules and laws, and that God would create a world that makes sense, they had the ability and the presupposition to examine that world. And that's where science comes from. It comes from this emergence of a robust Christian worldview. But eventually, these attitudes drifted from being deistic to being agnostic to being atheist to then expanding beyond. I'm going to give you two illustrations of this. Diderot is one of the leaders of the French Enlightenment, ends one of his books with this agnostic prayer. Listen to what he says. "Oh God, I don't know if you exist. I ask nothing in this world, for this course of events is determined by its own necessity." In other words, from the Enlightenment perspective, God is probably not there, but if he is there, he's irrelevant. One other illustration. Kant was described as the philosopher who summed up the achievement of the Enlightenment. He argued that the category of knowledge could only be used about sensory objects, about objects you can see, feel, and touch. So you can't know God. You can't know knowledge about God or God's revelation, because all you can know is that which you can see and touch. Do you see how the impact of that drifts into the fact that you have no knowledge about God, no knowledge of the gospel, no knowledge from Scripture? If those presuppositions are the foundation on which you build, it completely shapes your understanding of Christianity. It completely shapes everything else. One of the most powerful ways Enlightenment philosophy shaped thinking about Christianity was skeptical biblical criticism. They began to operate from these philosophical ideas, these principles, and the result was everything was viewed with skeptical eyes. Biblical criticism became a critical tool in the critique of historic Christianity. Okay. Now, a third area is in Enlightenment philosophy that emerged into materialism. And it was shaped partly by Darwin's ideas, with the Darwinian naturalism he produced of a mechanism for developing the naturalistic worldview that many people already were beginning to hold by the middle of the 1800s. Within his own lifetime, Darwin's ideas were widely accepted. And there became this, even though I just briefly touched on the fact that Christianity was the mother of science, all of a sudden there became this contrast between faith and science. It's not that way in terms of when you look at historically, but all of a sudden this emerged as if there was a conflict between Christianity and science. The result of all of these movements created a crisis of faith and a birth of modern unbelief. During the second half of the 19th century, an entire generation of Christians were swept off their feet. It's if like one foot was in a boat of their childhood faith, their family faith, and another foot was on the boat of their education, and slowly these two boats were being pulled apart. What would you do? Many of them leapt for the boat of education. And they looked back on their childish belief, their family faith, as, just longingly, but feeling like, I can't believe that anymore. Okay? They were educated out of their faith. Now, all this comes to a head. What happened to the church? What happened to these individuals? There are several responses people made to this. Some became agnostics. They said, I can't know anymore. I don't know if this is true or not. Others accepted what came to be called liberal theology. And liberal Christians are those who want to hold on to the categories of Christianity, but they put new content into it. It's like I have a glass of coffee or a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden I pour the coffee out and I put Coke in it. I still have the glass or the cup, but no longer do I have the content anymore. And that's exactly what liberal Christians do. A friend of mine who was one of my advisors at Northwestern University wrote a Christology. And I said, Jim, you got to tell me, you don't believe any of this. You don't believe in historic Christianity. You don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. You don't believe in the Trinity. How in the world can you write a Christology? That makes no sense. And he said, just because I don't believe what the church has always believed doesn't mean I can't use the categories. Okay? Liberal Christians are continuing to use categories but putting new content into them. That's why it's so fuzzy when you interact with them, because you don't understand that when you first start talking to them. The third group retreated into a fideistic position, a privatized faith. They're separating their faith from their minds and saying, I need to believe in God. This is an issue in my mind. Nobody can argue someone into heaven, all these things. They gave up the idea that we were supposed to persuasively communicate why the gospel is true. That's what the Apostle Paul did. That's what others did in the early church. It was called the Age of the Apologists. They gave up the convictions of the truthfulness of the gospel. So what's the lesson from the Great Awakening? In 1850, after 100 years of uninterrupted success, the evangelical church was ready to collapse, and they didn't know it. They didn't know it. They didn't realize they were a ship that was holed under the water, and they were going to sink within the next generation. They didn't realize it. We're exactly that same place right now with the developing world. This movement of unbelief has already gone from Europe and now is traveling into America. In the last few months, there have been a series of reports on National Public Radio in the States on the nuns, the N-O-N-Es, the nuns. Those are the people who mark nuns on their forms when they say, what religion are you? Catholic, Baptist, nuns. That's increased dramatically. One of the fastest growing movements in America is the nuns. None of the above, the atheists and the agnostics. The failure of the Great Awakening is a lack of awareness of what's going on, of the reality that at the same time you're focusing on the popular evangelism and these wonderful goals that are important goals, you're not doing the difficult work of developing the solid leaders. I call them spiritual oak trees. The Great Awakening built this movement of spiritual ivy, but they're very low, slowly rooted, small roots, and so they can be quickly rooted and pulled up, unrooted and pulled up. There wasn't any spiritual oak trees to protect the ivy from the storms of unbelief. So the Enlightenment comes along, and there's an inadequate apologetic response to these challenges, and the result is that ivy is just ripped up. Okay, from the global perspective now, we can bring that lesson to bear, I think. The developing world from the bird's eye view of the Great Awakening. Today, we're in a startling situation that's very similar to England in this 100-year growth pattern. They grew for 100 years and then collapsed. We're in danger in the developing world. We think it's going great, it's going wonderful, but in fact, in the developing world, we're in danger of the same thing they were in England in 1850, thinking everything's going great and not realizing that we're actually losing the battle. And we're not developing the intellectual leaders, and we're not developing the antidotes to the spiritual virus that we've talked about. We're vulnerable right now in the developing world and in America because we're not focused on this goal. So how should we invest? How should we respond? How should we respond to this, this talk? Thus far, it's been fairly depressing, hasn't it? Okay, God is never depressed, and God calls us not to be depressed. God calls us to hope and to confidence and to truth. And when we look back in history again, we see something else. We see another model of how to approach this situation. In this situation, the early church had a very similar growth path for the first 100 years of the early church, but it didn't go down. They continued for another 100 years and another 100 years. For over 300 years, the early church grew in the midst of the most difficult situation, in the midst of a situation where they were persecuted, in a situation where they were under attack, and yet the church grew this kind of way. What did they do? What was involved in the early church? One historian summarized it with this phrase. He said the early Christians outthought and outlived their contemporaries. Outthought and outlived their contemporaries. I'm just going to talk briefly about both of those. Think about our Western educated elite right now in America. Fundamentally, antagonistic to the gospel. Relativistic, pluralistic worldviews, very anti-Christian philosophies. They rule our cultural elite centers. The Northwesterns, the Ivy League, NBC, ABC. I mean, those ideas have percolated down right now. This is where we are. In the Roman context, there were very few Christians that led the Roman centers of control and influence. Very few led Roman legions, educated the Roman elite, or led Roman institutions. What did the early Christians do in response to the situation? Let's look at the Apostle Paul real briefly. The Apostle Paul faced non-Christian thinkers in the marketplace, and he explained why Christianity is true, why the gospel is true. In Acts 17, we have him in two different situations. In one situation, he's talking to the Jews. It says, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue and showed them from the scriptures why Jesus was the Christ. Showing, proving, arguing, demonstrating. All those words are used to talk about how he showed them from the scriptures, talking about their authority, their categories. He started where they were, and he communicated the gospel in a way that made sense to them. When he talked to the Greeks, what did he do? He talked about the unknown God. He talked about the statue of the unknown God. He talked about, I see you're very religious. He referred to their Greek poets. He referred to philosophical Greek ideas, and in this context communicated why the gospel is true. In both of these, he's doing the same thing. It's the same gospel, but he's persuasively communicating the gospel. We need to recover the fact of persuasively communicating the gospel and the idea that the gospel is true and that the biblical worldview is true, and thus we can look at anything from a biblical worldview and we can understand it in a way because we can put God's lenses on that brings things into focus. So a commitment to truth, a commitment to the gospel, a commitment to communicating the gospel, first lesson. Second is the early Christians outlived their contemporaries. There's a fascinating comment by Emperor Julian, some point later in the history of the Roman Empire. At this point, the church is growing so fast and they're seeing so much progress that it's becoming known, it's become public. And Julian is complaining. At one point in one of his letters, he writes, and he explains why the Christians are growing so fast, because they're rendering loving service to strangers. Because they're living this truth, they're loving people, they're caring for people, they're taking care of the orphans and the widows. In other words, it's not just an intellectual game, it's not just intellectually, it's they're living a reality with God that's demonstrating the truthfulness of the gospel. It's both the truth and life. We worship in truth and spirit. These two things go together. And you see the same thing, that so many things are demonstrations of this in the early church, this reality of a different, changed life. If we don't have that, all we have is correct doctrine, and it will be stale and it'll be artificial. It will not be real. It's both and, it's not either or. So how do we respond to this situation? I think we need to think about, wrestle with the issue of how to pray for and work to raise up the next generation of European evangelical leaders. We need to think like the CDC. Instead of waiting till the disease comes to our borders and we start to wrestle with it, we go there and we understand it and we find antidotes and we find a response to it in Europe. Because these things, if we don't find ways to treat it there, those same diseases are going to go around the world. And we can best serve, in many ways, all of our brothers and sisters around the world if we develop antidotes now. That, at its heart, is what the European Leadership Forum is trying to do. We're trying to re-evangelize the dark continent, the new dark continent, and we're trying to see a renewal of the biblical church, and we're doing that by identifying, uniting, equipping, and resourcing evangelical leaders toward this vision of re-evangelizing Europe and renewing the biblical church. And by the grace of God, God's doing something.